lot of food, and so we invite you and welcome you to that. Happy Sabbath, church. It's so good to be here with you with a sermon that relates again to our ongoing conversation about a dragon in our nativity. I won't be speaking much about the dragon today, but we are speaking on an issue related to this, and the issue related to this is the Hardest Commandment. We've spent some time talking about the commandments and which ones are particularly not which ones, but the whole call to obey God, the call to keep His commandments. And today we're going to explore the hardest commandment. His name wasn't always Tameh. That wasn't always his name. It was his given name. And his name was given to him when he decided it was time to go and get something checked. You know how it is. Sometimes something shows up and you're like, I need to see the doctor about this. Well, for Tameh, what showed up was some sores on his body, some discoloration. Maybe first beginning on his hands and moving up his arms, showing up on his face. Suddenly it was something he couldn't just pull his robes in and cover. It was everywhere. But for him, it wasn't an issue of going to the doctor. It was an issue of going to the temple, going to the priest, and being examined, because he feared that what he was seeing coming upon his body was dreaded leprosy. So that day when he went to the temple, he entered into the exam room, so to speak, of the priest, pulled his robes away, and showed his skin. And the priest said one word that would change this man's life forever. Tameh. Unclean. Tameh. So it was his given name, and it became his identity, not his real name, but his identity that he had to use whenever he was in public. Talk about social distancing. Can you imagine being ill and having to announce your illness everywhere you went? Tameh, Tameh, unclean, unclean. Imagine in our current world, the last couple of years, somebody walking around going, COVID, COVID. You'd give this person a wide berth, right? Of course, in that time and in that understanding, and you can talk to scholars about leprosy. Scientists, you can get all kinds of different answers. What was it really? But in the understanding of the people, and in the case of that time, it was incurable. It was a life sentence, unclean, banished from your family, banished from your community, gone out into the wilderness somewhere where you could keep a wide enough berth to continue to live your life, either in isolation or among a colony of others whose name was also Tameh, unclean. And so there he was, living in his mountain cave, all by himself, doing what he could do to stay free from exposure to others, when suddenly, instead of being alone on his mountain, he heard voices and footsteps and chatter, as if a large group was traveling onto his mountain and into his place. And as he heard those voices, he peered out of his cave, and down below he saw hundreds, if not thousands of people coming onto his mountain and sitting down on the ground to listen to one man, a preacher. who began to almost imitate Moses and others on the Mount of Blessing, on the story of Israel's exodus, of blessings and cursings, only this time all Tameh hears at first is blessing. He hears these kinds of words: blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you. Rejoice, the preacher on the mountain says, and be glad, the preacher on the mountain says, for great is your reward in heaven. For so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. And as Tameh hears these words, he suddenly thinks to himself, how is it that in my situation, the most cursed of my day, I hear blessing on my mountain? He hears those words and he thinks to himself, I am most certainly poor in spirit. I am most certainly one who mourns. I have been brought to the lowest level of meekness. I hunger and thirst for some kind of righteousness. I wish somebody would be merciful to me. I wish I had purity of heart. I wish I could make peace, not so much with other people, but I wish I could make peace with God because I feel separated from Him. Boy, do I feel persecuted. Probably not for righteousness' sake, probably for my own sin, probably for my own mistakes, Tameh thinks to himself. I am certainly reviled. I am certainly persecuted. People certainly utter all kinds of evil against me whenever they see me on the street shouting, Tameh, Tameh, unclean, unclean. Words of blessing have come to his mountain. And he wonders, are these true words for me? He begins to think to himself, maybe this is a new master that can free me from the curse of the law. Maybe he's going to take all the rules that condemned me to this condition and put those rules aside and set me free. And then he hears the teacher say, do not think that I've come to abolish the law or the prophets. I'm not here to wink at sin or to wipe away the rules. I haven't come to abolish them. I've come to fulfill them. For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not one iota, not one dot will pass from the law until all is accomplished. As Tameh listens to these distant words, he begins to realize that instead of this teacher of blessing giving him a break and setting aside the law and setting him free from the rules and the regulations that have banished him from his family and have banished him into the wilderness, this teacher feels that the law is firm. But he also hears something else in the language. He hears this language of fulfilling the law. And he begins to wonder if maybe there's something else at work. Teacher goes on, therefore, whoever relaxes one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven, but whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, the teacher says, Unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. And suddenly Tomei is overcome by the words of this teacher. Never. And where's the standard? The righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees, the righteousness of those who declared him unclean. The righteousness of those who banished him away because he wasn't measuring up. Those were the ones that sent him out. And he knew his righteousness didn't come anywhere close to theirs. And he suddenly finds himself saying, no one can be that good. Inside of his cave, as he looks out upon the people and the preacher, there's this voice that they hear too. No one can be that good. No one can live up to that kind of standard. I'll never enter the kingdom of heaven. If that's the level of goodness, I felt hopeless with those words. The teacher went on. Now, as if he was offering a midrash, an interpretation of the law, he began to take the law and break it down in ways that didn't give Tomei more hope. It gave him more fear. He took the law. Laws like don't murder. Laws like do not commit adultery. Laws like the law about giving a certificate of divorce if you were unhappy in your marriage. Laws like an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. And this teacher took those laws and began to say, you have heard that it was said, do not murder. But I say to you. And as Tomei heard this, he thought, wait a minute, what I hear in the voice of this man, what I hear him express is love. Maybe what this teacher is doing is this teacher is taking the law and he's saying, you've heard this rule, but just love instead. Tomei thinks to himself, he thinks, that'd be great. Wouldn't it be wonderful if instead of having to follow all the rules and instead of having to follow all the laws, I could be just free from the law and all I would need to do is love. After all, isn't that what the world needs, is love, more love, he thinks to himself. And then, as the teacher says, you have heard that it was said, do not murder, but I say unto you, don't be angry. Don't hate someone in your heart. And Tomei realizes, he sees the connection. He realizes that the teacher isn't taking the law and making it easier. The teacher is taking the law and he's making it harder. And he's making it harder because now he's saying it's not enough just to not pull out the knife and stab someone till they die. If you're angry and if you hate someone, you're already a murderer in your heart. It's as if the teacher is saying, you want to talk about love? You want to reduce the law to love? You think that makes it easier. It doesn't. It makes it harder. Because if you want to be judged by whether or not you murder somebody versus whether or not you love somebody, it got more difficult. It didn't get more easy. You think it's enough to not commit the sinful act of adultery? You think it's enough to avoid sexual sin? This teacher says, don't even think about it. Don't even contemplate it. Don't even fantasize in your mind about it. The law of love is harder than the law written on stone. What about this law for a certificate of divorce? In Tomei's day, the only one that could get a divorce was the man. The women were like prisoners in marriage. They couldn't get out, even if they wanted to. But the man could get out for any reason, and if she burnt the dinner one night, that was it. That was enough. Didn't take much. And the teacher says, you've heard that that's the rule. But I say to you, and he suddenly puts more pressure on the men. If you divorce somebody and you don't have a real reason, you and she are guilty of adultery. The teacher takes the law and its letter and makes it harder by talking about love. He illustrates the problem of the heart related to sin. And then when you take this law, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, Tameh is thinking, okay, now the teacher's going to finally be on our side. Because certainly this law of retaliation, right? Somebody says an insult to you, you slap them in the face, right? And the teacher takes this law of retaliation. You have heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. I mean, certainly love doesn't apply to enemies, does it? Certainly there should be some people that you're free to slap across the face, right? Well, teacher says that you have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Somebody pokes out your eye, you poke out theirs. Somebody knocks out your tooth, you knock out theirs. It's just good old-fashioned justice, after all. And the teacher says, don't resist an evil person. In Tameh's day, if a Roman soldier wanted you to carry his backpack, he could take you, and according to the law, he could make you go a mile. And the teacher says, don't just do a mile, do 2. Show your enemy love. Give him more than he asked for, not less. And if he slaps you across the face, don't hit back. Turn the other cheek and let him give you a real solid slap. And as the teacher says these words, everybody on the mountainside can now hear this voice echoing from the cave as Tameh listens in and says, not that, not that. And he begins to huddle into the cracks of the rocks and say to him, nobody can be that good, not as righteous as the scribes and Pharisees. I will never enter the kingdom of heaven. There's no way. And he felt hopeless with these words. This teacher, he took the rules, he took the law, and said it's not enough that you follow them to the letter, it's that you follow them with your heart. It's not enough that you have law, it is essential that you have love. But love, the teacher also is teaching, is the hardest law. Because anybody, by just self-control and determination, can keep the letter of the law. But how in the world do you love, especially when that standard means even loving your enemies? How is that done? Tameh feels hopeless. And suddenly his hope that somehow love will make it easier causes it all to just come crashing down. He's still thinking about this law of retaliation, and he wonders to himself, did he really mean enemies? Maybe just be nice, get along, you know. And is he really talking about enemies? Maybe he doesn't really want us to love everyone. And then the teacher says this. You've heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. And as Tameh hears these words, his heart starts to melt inside of him a little bit. And he starts to realize that this teacher is doing more than just shaking up his system and his world and his views. This teacher's words begin to melt his heart. And he thinks about that priest that he's been angry with, the one who said, your name is Tameh, your name is unclean. Go tell everybody you're unclean, but get out of my sight. And he began to think about that priest, and he began to realize and recognize that enemy he was now called to love. And he not only believed that he should, he believed that he could. And his heart began to melt within him, and he began to recognize and hear those words of the teacher, pray for those who persecute you. You mean the people on the street when I'm yelling, Tameh, Tameh, unclean, unclean? Pray for them. The people that glare at me, the people that step aside, the people that go, "Who? That's horrible. Don't look at him." Pray for them. And the master says, yes. Because there's something about loving, really loving even your enemies, that makes you a lot like your Father in heaven. The teacher goes on. For your Father, he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and he sends rain on the just and the unjust. For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Even tax collectors, even the IRS loves their friends. You can do better, the teacher says. In fact, I'll help you do better. Teacher goes on. And if you greet only your brothers, what more do you have than others? Are you doing than others? Do not even the Gentiles do the same? Yet therefore you must be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. And for a moment, Tameh begins to have some doubt. Okay, now you've made it too far. It was bad enough that my righteousness had to be as high as the teachers of the law and the scribes and the Pharisees. But now you're telling me I have to be as good as my Father? And yet Tameh also feels this. He feels that as he hears those words, he becomes those words. As this teacher speaks, the miracle of love is formed in his heart. And he feels both utterly helpless to actually love and suddenly capable of loving in a way that he never has before. And he's torn by that feeling. And he begins to wonder, can I do that? I can't do that, but I can. And I can. And then he hears this voice. Yep, you can. Ask, and it will be given to you. Seek, and you will find. Knock, and it will be opened to you. For everyone who asks receives, and the one who seeks finds, and to the one who knocks it will be opened. And he thinks to himself, that's what I'll do. I'll ask. I'll ask that he heal me. I'll ask that he restore me. I'll ask that he do the complete work that he's already doing in my heart. And he pulls his ragged clothes together in that cave. Pulls himself from hiding in the crack between the rocks and suddenly begins to scramble down. And as the preacher wraps up his talk and begins to finish his presentation, Tameh approaches him and finds himself there in the presence of this teacher. And as he runs towards the teacher, the crowd disperses. It's like, whoa, we can tell this is a leper a mile away. And he does what he's supposed to do. Tameh, Tameh, unclean, unclean. And everybody spreads out to either side. But this one teacher walks closer, keeps stepping towards him as he steps towards him. And he kneels before the teacher. And he says, Lord, if you will, you can make me clean. And then he sees something. He sees a hand come out towards him. Something he hasn't seen in years. Just that physical gesture of somebody reaching out to become close, reaching out to touch, and he hasn't been touched in who knows how long. He lifts up his hand as if to stop the hand and then leaves it up as if to worship. And the teacher touches him and says words of restoration into his body. I will be clean. And he can feel the rotten flesh fall from his body. He can feel youthful, vibrant skin erupt from within. And he finds himself looking at his hands and his body, and he's restored. He's new. He's clean. His name is now changed from unclean to clean. His name is no longer Tameh. His name is now Tamir. Clean. Clean. He's restored by the words of the teacher. And he begins to want to just celebrate it. I'm clean, and yell it to everybody. But as the teacher is there before him, reaching out and still touching him, the teacher says, shh, don't tell anyone. Don't say anything to anyone. I've got a project for you. I've got a mission for you. Because Tamir, clean, people like you come to me all the time. People who know that they are unclean, they come to me all the time. The tax collectors and the sinners, they come to me all the time. That crowd that was there with me on the mountain, they come to me all the time. But there's some people who don't come to me because they think that they have it all figured out, and they think that they have everything right, and they think that they're pure and that they're clean, and they think they're rich and increased in goods and in need of nothing, and they don't realize that they're poor, pitiful, blind, and naked. And they need some proof. They need some evidence. And I can't think of any better evidence to send them today than to send them you. Because the last time they saw you, you pulled back your robes and they said, Tameh, unclean. And I can't wait until you walk into that temple and they see you coming in there and you pull back your robes and they say, Tamir, clean, restored. Because this hasn't happened since Elijah the prophet was here. And those priests, they've never seen anything like this before. Because they pronounce a lot of people tameh, they pronounce a lot of people unclean, but they never, ever have pronounced somebody clean in their lifetime. And I can't wait until you go to them and you show them that the law is written in your heart and you give the gift that Moses commanded because you keep God's law. And then you stand as a proof to them of the restorative, life-saving, healing power of Jesus Christ. And I imagine that as the teacher, Jesus, says those words to this man now cleansed, he realizes that when that man enters the temple and that man presents himself to the priests, a prophecy of Scripture will be fulfilled in their experience. A prophecy from the book of Ezekiel, chapter 36, that says, "And the nations will know that I am the Lord when they see the proof of my friend Tamir, who's clean. They will find that I have vindicated my holiness through he who was once unclean. I'm going to take my people And I'm going to gather them from the nations, from all the countries, and bring them into their own land. And I'm going to sprinkle clean water on them, and they shall be clean. They shall all be clean from their uncleanliness, and from all their idols I will cleanse them. Not only that, I'll give them a new heart, so that not only would they keep my law by the letter, but they would keep my heart of my law of love, and a new spirit would be put within them. And I would remove their heart of stone, and I would give them a heart of flesh. Not only that, when they hear the story of this man who is healed and restored, I will put my spirit within them, and I will cause them to walk in my statutes. And they will be careful to obey my rules, and they will dwell in the land that I gave to them. And they will be my people, and I will be their God. And I will deliver them, all of them, the ones who know that they are tamah, and the ones who do not. The ones that know they are unclean, and the ones who do not know that they too are unclean. And I will deliver all of them from all of their uncleanliness. I will reach out my hand not only upon this leper, but I will reach out my hand upon all my people everywhere. And they will be restored. Friends, we live in a world where the devil is a divider. The serpent in the nativity wants to put people in one group or another, and he doesn't care what group you're in as long as you're in a group that has enemies in another group. But I think when he restores our hearts and he puts genuine love in our hearts, we aren't going to be divided into factions, and we aren't going to be divided into tribes. Instead, we will be standing together. And we will be saying things like, I will pray for you, please pray for me. I'm here to encourage you, please encourage me. And instead of there being this division and this notion of enemies, there will only be love, and we will lift each other up in the presence of Almighty God. I pray that it is that spirit and that heart that comes upon you now as we listen to a song that describes the experience of being tamir, of being clean.